Well, we thought we should co-present as we present on co-collecting, because this is an example which is, I guess, either maybe our worst practice example?
Yeah, I think for me it's the worst practice I ever did.
Yeah, and I agree that's the same for us as a museum. But at the same time, it's a very interesting case probably, because this project was a project which was initiated by Brazil, you could say. It had an interest in accessing European collections and making new acquisitions to European collections. It was executed by external participants greatly, organized at least, and the planning, etc. And then it has an effect. It has had an effect on the collections of 4 European museums. So in that sense, it is really a cooperative, collaborative kind of project, but at the same time there were several problems which we learned a lot from. And as I think it was someone from Marseille, right, who wrote, will we also be presenting worst practices? Well, we had already decided that we didn't only have to present best practices, we could also expect practice that we learned a lot from. Do you want to?
Yeah, so the project was about bringing indigenous community from Brazil in contact with the European collections. And to be really honest, I mentioned that sometimes it's a very big problem to get financial resources for projects like this, to invite people. It was much more easier to get money from for acquisitions. And so we said, okay, we're inviting the people to come to Europe, and they bring as a present a new collection. Yeah, so that was the deal. Yeah, and this is important to remember, because some of my colleagues ask me, are these objects really worth the money? Because they thought it was an acquisition and it was so expensive, they didn't see that it's more than just an acquisition, but it's also a project, and that we try to make a collaborative thing.
In our case, it was the way that it was presented to us, because we will give some context on the organizational context, but the way that it was presented to us is that people in Brazil had indicated that after seeing photos from our collections, from the European collections, they said, we do not feel like that we are being represented well in your collections. We want to make new collections for you, new acquisitions for you, where we feel better represented in your collections. So to us, this was a pilot in post-colonial collecting, because we were not going to see the collections before we were going to admit them into our collections. So actually the whole authority on how people wanted to be represented, what the collection should look like, was going to be, the authority was going to be with the indigenous peoples who were the representatives of indigenous peoples and creators of the objects, who were actually themselves documenting the process, who were going to be putting these collections. We were going to accept them whatever they were. It didn't really matter what they were going to be.
So it's a little bit the idea to have material so that indigenous curator can come to the museum and make exhibitions which are more like an auto-ethnography. And so, yeah, that was what we hoped to get.
Right. So what was important to know is that the project was actually... Sorry? Yeah. The project was actually... No, that's fine.
Okay.
The project was actually initiated by a photographer who is, I think, a Swiss Brazilian photographer who lives both in Switzerland and in Brazil, and she wanted to make a photographic project on acculturation, and she wanted to make a comparative photography of people who were on pictures from Franz Caspar, who was an important collector in Brazil in the 1940s, and compare them to the same people in the picture today. So that was the project that she had. Then another person, there were lots of people involved. What she did actually, she showed these pictures, the old pictures, to people in Brazil, and that's when they started saying, okay, we want to see if we can come and look at those collections, we want to see the old objects, we want to also trigger the memory, be inspired again by those collections, by the collections that are in Germany. The person who was actually, in the end, financing much of this project, apart from the acquisition budgets, which are always limited in ethnographic museums. But so we decided to use the acquisition budgets to pay part of the trip, but a big part of the trip was actually financed by Andreas Schlotthauer, who's an independent researcher who's doing research on feather collections throughout all of Europe. He's visited about 40 or 50 museums in Europe, made a huge database of all the featherworks and club collections that are in European collection, but he's also a collector of contemporary objects, and he is also a financer. He is independently wealthy and is able to finance some of these things. Gleese is a photographer, and then there were institutional partners, and it was Alexander Brust, who should actually also be here with us, who initiated the first contacts with Gleese and with Andreas too, and then we were also invited as partners. I think Leiden was the last partner, and Berlin was actually the last partner to sign up. And then there was a FUNAI who needed to be involved to be able to get people permits to actually travel outside of the Brazilian territories. And then these are the people, the indigenous participants from 5 different communities. I have some pictures also of the places they traveled. So they were here for 3 weeks and traveled by bus to, they arrived, I think, first in Switzerland, then went to Vienna, then went to Berlin, and then traveled to the Netherlands, all by bus with the collections in the trunk of the bus. So you can imagine that these are, and many of them had to travel about 3 to 7 days first to get out of their own indigenous territories to be able to get to the airplanes that would take them, all the way to Europe, first to the capital, probably to Sao Paulo, and then fly to. Why did they have to travel all these long ways? Leiden didn't have collections of these areas before, but there were a number of German collectors who had collected very extensively in the 50s and in the 30s in the areas of Rondônia, which are areas which are actually quite remote in Brazil. They are close to the Bolivian border, and the territories of the Rio Branco, Terra Indigena are especially known because of the erosion which takes place. There's been enormous amounts of industry which has been put into place in these areas. So I guess that's also one of the reasons why these indigenous lands are, and the indigenous peoples living in them were so interested in seeing the old ethnographical collections. Say something about, yeah. Okay. Terra Indigena, and then these travelers had actually traveled right up rivers where a lot of the people that came here are living. I don't know if this, yeah. So there's these places here along the river. You can see like the little dotted lines. Those are Schnettlager and Kaspar, who actually traveled along those places, and that's how these collections ended up in our European collections. You want to talk? Yeah. Then the current political context actually that right now in Brazil of indigenous people is one of exploitation, one where they're actually making camps, revolutionary how do you say that? Acampamento? Yeah, just camps, yeah, where they're claiming for rights which are territorial rights which are also the right to education, the right to public health. Some of them have lived for months around the times that they were visiting here. Actually, a couple of years later, people lived for months in the capitals to try and finally get recognition to the rights that they actually deserve. While mining companies are being as you see, very well protected by the government. That doesn't go for much of the indigenous territories. So there's a very real political context of where many of the objects that you will see were actually given to us as these acquisitions are actually being worn in a very political context. And that was the same what actually happened when people came here, that they were also in a political fight was actually part of the whole deal.
And it was interesting to see that the group was mixed. There were some young leaders, they were chosen by the communities, and there were also some elders who bring more knowledge about history. And so, for example, José Augusto Canoë, you see him on the left side. I'm focusing on the group of the Canoë because we have the collection of the Canoë and we got the new collection of the Canoë. And he, for example, he tried for several months to get an appointment with the governor of Rondônia state. And in Berlin, for example, he had a reception at the Brazilian embassy. Yeah? So that was for him a really important experience, that he can meet people of this high rank of Brazilian government, not in Brazil, but in the European context. Yeah? So when they arrived in Vienna, they stayed there for only 3 days, which was a very short period. And to be honest, Alexander Brust really exhausts them in Basel, because one of the things which I see as a problem of this special visit was that they try to make a good trip for everybody, yeah. And Andreas Schlottauer, for example, he insists of having public events, visiting the major hall, have a guided tour in the cities, yeah. But also, and this went far from the time we can spend in the collection and really talk with the people. So I had this experience that it was more a collecting tourism, that a kind of research, or that we really had the possibility to exchange knowledge about the collections. And it was for me also, it was never clear for me, for example, if what a museum was for José Augusto. How often he visited a museum before? How did they choose the objects they made? The idea was that they think about self-representation, but I think it's difficult to think about self-representation when you never made an exhibition, something like this. When you ask the baker at the street, please, what would you choose to represent the Dutch people in a museum? Maybe he would say, oh, come on, that's hard. And we had on Wednesday night, we had a public event where we presented some of the objects to the public, and we had some speeches, especially about the political situation in the region. And I had this great idea, come on, José Augusto, you can choose the objects we are putting in some of the showcases. And after 1.5 hours, he came back to me and said, Claudia, please, can you choose the objects? I think you know how to do this. Yeah, so it was for him a little bit, maybe too much. Yeah, and it was just 2 days in Vienna, and then he has to make a little exhibition. So that was difficult. And we had some time. The next one, some time, of course, to speak on the objects. And the Canoë were asked before to give some information on the objects, which you can see in the next picture. So it is this very classical kind of museums label. They had to fill in the name in the proper language and what material they use and all these things. But we never had time to discuss it. And as the whole trip was documented by a professional film team, we thought, okay, fine, we get all the conservations on the documentary and on the film material, which was promised to us. But afterwards, there was a big discussion about the copyright of the film material, so we never got the material. And also the indigenous people never got the material. So the most part of the documentation, in our case, is lost. And we were only 2 people, and we took care for, I think there were 15 people or something like this. So it was a really big group. And so, for example, when we enter the storage and the people saw the same first time the objects, I was searching for the cameraman because he was lost in the basement. Yeah. So these are also organizing problems. You need a lot of people to organize such a project in a very, very short time. And so at the end, I had the feeling, okay, the museum has a little benefit because we have this collection now, but I couldn't imagine what could be the benefit really for the people who came to Vienna. That was not so clear for me at the end of the project, but I want to say to this more a little bit later.
In Leiden, I think it's important to know that the context where this project, when people arrived in Leiden, it was also for 1.5 days. It was very short, and we were in the middle of consultations with community curators from Suriname, which we brought over in a much longer process of community engagement with people who were actually experts on material culture, because they were makers and producers of material culture, so they very much had an embodied knowledge also of the language, etc. And we had grown accustomed to having all the time in the world to talk about each object. We would discuss sometimes half a day because they were here for 3 weeks. We worked with interpreters of the languages who are here in Leiden, and so who have a long established relationship with us and with the communities who they had invited experts from. So we had done a lot of blessings, and we'd done a lot of rituals. We did both in our exhibits. This is in the Tropen Museum. We went to several exhibits in the Netherlands. So we had like a very considerate and thoughtful process where we could actually enter into a certain relationship building. And then we had also thought that we wanted, they would like to go, they wanted to go to see the North Sea, because they had never been to the beach and seen the sea. So we thought that would be a great place where both the people from the different delegations could meet. So we would have people from the Surinamese delegations and people from the Brazilian delegations. We set up a meeting with people, so this is when all the objects had come into our museum. We had a little bit of a problem conservationally because there were cockroaches in some of the objects, and for the one time our collection management had said, okay, we won't freeze in the objects when they get into the because there was such little time, and they were completely also engaged in trying to make sure that the objects could enter and we could still get some information about the objects. So immediately we had to call rent or kill and seal off the building, and it was all a big issue. But even then we were able to actually sit down and try to document a little bit, but just compared to the way we would normally do collecting, this time was really sitting with, we luckily had a translator with us, and we would talk to Anisio Arua, who was one of the people who, and I'll show you some film material, I hope, if it works, later on. And we also had people, this is Anisio telling us how some of the objects were being used. We tried to, but they also wanted to do a meeting with the public, and this is where also the ambassador of Brazil actually came, so they had a good meeting in that sense also. They would always wear their feather headdresses, which I asked, so is this what you do at home too? Because even when we were going out for dinner, they would, and in Suriname that's not at all the case, but they said, no, we're here as political representatives, because it's also part of the lucha, of the fight, the fight of having to try and see that there's enough public representation. That is also why we're here. So in that sense, to them, it sounded like that's what they were getting out of the project also partly. And so, so everything we did was very hasty. We have information, some information documented, but it really felt like almost hit and run kind of collecting, but then the other way around. This is where Anisio Arua is showing us how he, one of the objects that he brought is used. I wonder if this is going to work. You see, this is when we get together.
25.
This is the shout they use, or the sound they use when we are going to go fighting. The earlier was when they just get together to discuss things. And the guy who's filming is one of our Surinamese experts. The person who's sitting next to Anisio is Helene. She actually has made a transcription on the internet of Gaspar's material, and of Schnetlage's material. She's worked a lot with that. So we had assured that from our, and she works in our linguistic department together with her husband, and we have several experts in Leiden University. So we had invited them, and that's actually the part that, and there had not been any real attention given during the whole, because this is where they ended their journey. Real attention given to language preservation and language, recording of language, etc. So that to them, to the representatives, they indicated that to them was the most important part of the journey, of the part that they did in Leiden actually, is being able to talk to people who could study the language, the preservation of language also. Most of them are, there's a couple of the languages, there's only like 70 speakers left, so they're really endangered languages. So to them that was really great to know that there were people studying the language and doing research on that. But it was, so we gave a lot of time to that also. We said, this is, to you, this is the most important part, so let's give enough time for that part. There were some parts where, you know, and the public enjoyed talking to them and enjoyed being able to actually learn from their experiences. But there were still, if we want to give some thoughts on how this project and why we're calling it a worst practice, because there were lots of things which of course are interesting in the project, but there was also a lot of problematic points, which we've already mentioned, I think. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I think the first thing was, of course, the planning, especially with external partners who are not really knows the needs of the museums, but also not the need of the community. Yeah, so you have another communication partner where information is getting lost. So, for example, afterwards we heard that Andreas said to them, the museum are interested in objects which are not in use anymore, which only the elder people can still make, yeah? And we were interested in contemporary items or in just what they want to bring, yeah? So we heard that there was a little influence. And the communication, the idea was to create a long-term relationship, but you mentioned it earlier that this is very difficult because of human resource. And I had the only possibility, I was in 2011, 2 years later, I visited José Augusto Canoë in his home in Ricardo Franco. And that was one of the very positive effects, because I thought at this point that was really a bad project. Yeah? But when I came to Ricardo Franco, José Augusto, I recognized that he had this impression, there are people in Europe who appreciate our culture, who are interested. I had the possibility to speak to people, to speak to Brazilian representatives, yeah? And so his interest in in the history of his people, and he started to learn his language again. Yeah? He never spoke Canoë, and now he learned with some linguists who are working in the region, he tried to learn his language, and together with his father he wrote down the history of the Canoë from the last 50 years, which is just, I think, 2 or 3 pages, but it's an amazing document about the history of these people, and we had the chance to publish it in a catalog in Portuguese and in German, so we were able to give a very, very tiny thing back to the Canoë. But so I was really impressed that for him the experience was, thanks God, not as bad as for me.
So we have a lot of questions, and we'll keep it short. Well, no, don't worry. About self-representation. Was this really what was happening here? Autoethnography, did it take place in, or is it reflected in the collections that we have now included in our collections? The same, was this a post-colonial, or who were actually the authority in this? Was it Gleise? Was it Andreas? Was it who was there really anyone who was claiming authority? So there's lots of questions here that we still could address much longer. Some of the advantages have been the collections, obviously, the contacts, and that we learned a lot from this worst practice. And also that indigenous representatives, as Claudia was indicating, actually indicate deeper involvement and empowerment. So that is a really big plus for the project, if that's the way that was experienced by the participants. For us, I'm not going to try and pretend that we think that we should have, we were going to repeat the process as it took place, since after evaluation, we in Leiden, also the collection managers and the people who were involved in project sets, we're never going to do this hastily, no real partnership at an institutional level. And this way of collecting felt like, as I already said, hit and run kind of acquisitioning, which we certainly do not want to do as an institution. That we had too little involvement also in the way that things were set up, that we couldn't even prepare for what kind of food people needed, what were the needs of the people who were coming to visit. And that's really what you want to know. You want to know that you can be a good host if you're going to visit people, and build up some kind of, and ensure that the values that you think are important are being ensured, like respect and equivalency or parity or mutuality, understanding, a mutual sense of learning, clarity, empathy. Those are all completely lacking in the non-relationship that we built, actually. And that actually didn't feel like the way that we wanted to work as a museum. And also especially compared to how we had been working with the Surinamese communities. Nonetheless, last year, it did not mean our end of our relationships with Brazil, to the country. Together with Mariana Francoso, who's also here, we developed a project with the Guapore communities, together with the Gulgi Museum in Belém, which much better represented the way that we wanted to work. With time, working in our collections, having time to also do ritual and ceremonial parts of collecting, making a representation where it was actually the Guapore who completely took control over the way that they wanted to, the terms, the order, the needs that they had, they themselves indicated, and we made an exhibition together where really there was much more sharing of authority in as much as that is possible with the long distances that we had to cover, obviously. But that's a different project. But it doesn't mean that we will stop doing those projects. For us, it was a learning experience. And I think on a European level, what was nice about it is that it was really the first time that we tried at the European level to work together and make sure that these huge investments of time and money weren't only kept in one institution, which is actually the way that it usually works so far for our area of expertise, I guess, the Americas.
Okay. I just have to add that I made a better experience also with the Satare Maué from Brazil. If you are interested, it's documented in the catalog Beyond Brazil. And if you like, I can send you the PDF. But that's all. Thanks.